So back in the early 90s, the annual book fair in a small city like Guwahati was a huge affair. And I remember I loved looking at those pictures as a child more than just reading. And my father would make it a point to buy me those books. I would spend my winter evenings flipping over those pages again and again. I also remember that during that time, there was this uncle of mine who would come home on certain weekends. This is the kind of uncle that you find in weddings, social events, gatherings, who would grab hold of a child and force the child to repeat the same poem recited every time they meet the child. So I also had the ill fate of having such an uncle. And I remember he had come home and asked me to pick up a book from a pile, and he asked me to read and recite to him. And I picked up this book, which in Assamese was called Moi Ki Hom, which in Assamese means, who would I like to be when I grow up? And this book had this particular child character called Ranjan, and Ranjan would dream of various vocations on every page. In one, he was a doctor. In the other, an astronaut. In some other, he was an engineer. While I had already developed a lot of aversion against this particular uncle of mine, for he repeatedly asked me, who would I want to become when I grow up? Would I want to be an engineer like my father or him? Would I want to be a doctor, because we didn't have doctor in the family? Or would I want to be a scientist, for that was fancy? I remember not answering him, gawking at him, and wondering, why is this moron asking me to become someone else when I already am who I am? So how many of you have faced this question as children? Who would you like to be when you grow up? Maybe a raise of hands. Yes. And how many of you remember, looking at that annoying asking adult and wondering, why do I need to become someone when I already am who I am? So, yeah, apart from the temporal fallacy and the ambiguity of becoming someone when you already are who you are, I feel the greater fallacy lies in the question itself. Imagine if you were asked, what kind of life would you like to have? Would your answer still be the same? Maybe not. Because as children, we would have wished for a much happier life, a merrier life, a life full of excitement and adventure, and not merely the kind of life where you come back from office and in the evening you are washing plates till you wait for your wife to come back home, or waking up on Monday mornings and wondering if the maid will come or not, or say, worse, going to your office and seeing the face of that wretched boss every single day. It was only during the first year of my medical school that I found myself falling into this indecipherable and profound depression. I did not know what I was feeling. All my colleagues, my friends would come up to me and ask me what had gone wrong, and I would not be able to tell them, because at that moment I was diagnosed with clinical depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. I only remember that my grades had started falling, and from being that famed topper, I found my name in the compartmental list. My everyday job would be to go to the anatomy dissection hall and slice out the lungs and the heart from a cadaver and wonder, is this all to life? Something about the disintegrating pack of muscles, the unclogged organs and the drying blood, the very fact that the human body has the remarkable ability to hold itself together when it's alive and rot away when it's not, questioned my rational empirical mind for the first time. I was plagued with the idea of the soul and its inhabitability inside the body. And yet my medical mind did not let me, yes, so this is the soul basically, which I was plagued with. So my medical mind did not allow me to pursue that idea at that moment of time, because all such inquiries would either end up in religious discourses or theosophical or philosophical spaces. And I wondered why I could not be a theosophical philosopher at the same time, at the time when I was a doctor as well. Why could the two identities not exist? I realized I had lost my path because I had relied too much of importance on becoming someone, in this case that of a doctor, that I thought I must become in order to have a good life. The urgency and the immediacy of that identity was so compelling that I did not even think for once if I would like becoming that person or not. In my practice today, as a psychotherapist, I find a lot of people who are abusers, who are survivors or victims of sexual abuse, rape and molestation. What I commonly find in them is that a lot of these people are carrying the unfelt shame and the unfelt guilt of their abusers and their perpetrators. Because logically, it's the perpetrators and the abusers who should have felt the shame and guilt. But the very fact that they could roam scot-free and dump their unfelt negative feelings of guilt and shame on their victims made me question how much of what we feel is truly ours. Dr. Dan here, the famous life coach from this organization called Access Consciousness, tells us that 99% of what we feel is not even ours to begin with. So this is his question: who does this belong to? The moment you identify that a disturbing negative feeling in your body is not yours, you need to ask this question: who does this belong to? The moment you identify again that it is not yours, you could just say that send it back to the sender with all the consciousness attached. That's his line. But I believe the philosophy is so strong to even understand the fact that we are, as human beings, walking, talking Bluetooth, absorbing and picking up emotions from everywhere. Now, going back to the story of victims and survivors, a lot of these people do not want to give up the pain, the damage and the brokenness that they have suffered, because that's a significant part of their identity, significant part of their story. They are what they are today because of those experiences. And contrary to popular belief of courage and bravery, such notions could at times be dangerous because it doesn't let them become anything else apart from the life of the survivor or the life of the victim. I thought of myself as a victim too. For the longest time in my medical school, I kept thinking that I was just a victim, and I would like to digress and say that being a victim is actually easy. In the drama triangle, one could be a victim, one could be a persecutor, one could be a rescuer. And the victim is the only one who can just sit and relax while the other two at work. So I also decided to sit and relax and be a victim. I guess I had relied too much of importance on becoming a doctor and how a doctor's life should be. So much so that when that dream identity was gone, the dream life attached to it was also gone. But I guess I got lucky, because I stumbled upon this book on past lives. It was the fresh Brian Weiss, Dr. Brian Weiss, pervading through the spiritual junkie market. And one of my friends came up and told me that why should I not read this book? Now, Brian Weiss in this book talks about going back to past life, and which is previous lifetime, and resolving present life issues. And that's what we call as regression therapy. The word regression means going back in time. You can go back in time to yesterday, you can go back in time to day before yesterday, back in time to 10 years, 100 years, it doesn't matter. As regression therapists, we come from the school of thought that our presenting problems are not the real problems. Our presenting problems are a gateway to reach the original problem, which can be mediated through the process of regression by going back in time. Now, it doesn't matter whether these different lifetimes that we see in an experience of regression are true or false. Whether they are valid, whether they are authentic, it doesn't matter. What matters is when you move through this experience, you also realize that the event of trauma happened then and this is now. You realize that there is a distinction between the trauma happening then and happening now, which is also a healing process, and that's the kind of work I do. But then again, at that time I kept thinking that all of these metaphysical experiences of going to different lifetimes was nothing but imagination, without questioning whether imagination can also be a part of this same physical reality. Neuroscience will tell us that in the traditional model of vision, perception results from processing of data that comes from the object, streams to the eyes and goes in the appropriate region of cortex. As the famous neuroscientist David Eagleman says, that despite the simplicity of this idea of light going through the eyes and going to the cortex, this model is incorrect. Because the brain generates its own reality even before the sensory information reaches the brain. And this is what is called as the internal model. So the basis of this internal model can be found in the anatomy of the brain itself. There is a region of the brain called the thalamus, and the thalamus sits between the two eyes in front of the head and behind at the back of the head at the cortex. Now, when you are looking at an object, a lot of light ray information is passing through the eyes, then through the thalamus and going to the visual cortex. So a lot of sensory information connections move through the thalamus to end in the visual cortex. But there is a surprise here. 10 times as many such connections run in the opposite direction, which means from the cortex through the thalamus into the eyes. Which means at any moment, whatever you are experiencing as seeing relies less on the amount of light streaming into your eyes and going to your cortex, and more on what's already inside. And this is what was happening to me in a session of regression. I was locked in a state of trance, and my external world was shut. Hence, my internal model was generating feelings, ideas, vivid sounds, vivid colors, and vivid emotions. So, at the absence of an external world, the internal model was able to run free and wild. This experience of metaphysical experience backed with neurological understanding helped me change my attitude towards past lives. I realized that all these different lives that I was seeing were scattered and forgotten parts of me. But at the same time, I realized that these past lives demanded me so many things at the same amount of time, at the same point of time. These were lives which I did not either desire to live or lives that I wanted to live. But at the very core, it gave me a glimpse of the fact that I could be so many people and so many identities in one given moment of time. And I call these many selves as the different personal selves. Trans means beyond. Personal is the ego or the self. Okay, so the transpersonal self. And if psychiatrists like Carl Jung or Roberto Assagioli, these are psychiatrists who came up post-Freud, if they were alive, they would have called these parts of us as subpersonalities, for they were also involved in the experiencing the metaphysical in therapeutic framework. So going back to the point where I said that I could be so many things at one given moment of time. I could be so many things that I wasn't in this current life. Made me realize that what about this identity that I have today? Did it at all matter who I was today? Perhaps not. What mattered is what life was I willing to choose? What kind of life did I desire? This life, this current life. And that question became my portal to move out of that monstrous, insidious depression that all my friends, my colleagues and my parents thought I will never be able to get out. So that became my actual portal, my talisman, I would say. Human beings, I believe, are multidimensional beings. Psychologically, emotionally, physically, spiritually. Our brains and bodies change over time, all the time. Our red blood cells are replaced within a span of 120 days. Our skin cells are replaced within a few weeks. Every atom that you have in your body will be replaced in a span of 7 years. So physically, we are constantly a new I. So why stick to one identity? I would like to believe that one should first decide what kind of life one would like to have, and then figure out what are the different identities one can pursue to have that life. Can you be a doctor and have that life? Can you be a philosopher and have that life? Can you be a sex worker and have that life? Can you be a pole dancer and have that life? Unfortunately, when all my colleagues feared taking up subjects like pathology, microbiology, or physiology, for that would not allow them to have the stethoscope hanging around their neck, because these are non-clinical subjects. Like if I ask you right now, what is the actual image of a doctor? And you would say, oh, someone wearing a white coat and a stethoscope hanging around the neck. And they thought that by pursuing these non-clinical subjects, they would not be able to have that particular idea of who a doctor should look like and how a doctor should be. And in truth, they were running behind these identities and not perhaps happiness. They gave themselves these rigid identities of a surgeon or a gynecologist or a neurosurgeon, and in that process they had to give up those skills that came easily to them, and they picked up skills that were difficult and challenging, for they only believed that the difficult identity of a surgeon, of a gynecologist, of a cardiologist would give them a good life, as if that was the most imperative thing in this world. And like most of them, we don't care about happiness, we don't care about what life we would like to have. What we care about is this rigid identity of who I am today. And that's the problem with believing in a single identity, because once you believe in that identity, you will use that identity to create a life which in the end will not turn out to be the life that you actually desire. So when these same colleagues come up to me today as patients, fortunately, unfortunately, and they tell me that, oh, you know, life is so stressful, it's so challenging, this job is so stressful, my inner voice answers, well, precisely, yes, it is stressful. Because the seed of this difficult life, this stressful life, is laid long back when you begin to think, what identity would I like to have? Who would I like to become when I grow up? Instead of thinking, what kind of life would I like to have? And the latter, I'm sure you all will agree, is so much lighter, the latter question. So I leave it on all of you to explore, discover, and figure out your many different multidimensional identities and your transpersonal selves. And understand that once you are ready to embrace and own these many parts of you, the scattered, fragmented parts of you, you can be so many things in one given moment of time. And then, maybe the essential nature of life need not always be grave. It can be an easier one too. Thank you.